Yes, can we slowly start? Because we are beyond schedule already. Good afternoon, I'm István Rév. I'm the director of OSA Archives in Budapest, which is one of the more important archives of the transition process, besides other things. There is a last-minute change of the panel. Professor Tuma, in the last minute, was unable to come, but we have another presenter. Dr. Stanislav Ljubak kindly replaced Oldrich Tuma, and he will give a presentation on the transition process in Slovakia and the current problems. We have 3 presenters and then a commentator. Let me introduce the first speaker, Tomasz Stryjek, who is professor in the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences and also in Collegium Civitas. He is the author of several books, which I will not list here, and he will give a presentation on a very important area between transitional justice and politics of national identity, the role of the Ukrainian National Memory Institute in the state policy towards the Soviet legacy in the Ukraine. The presentation will be in Polish, but there will be English translation. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I should express my gratitude to be invited to this conference. I am not a specialist on this area, transitional justice, but I think I know about Ukraine enough. I'm a historian, yes, and I know enough about Ukraine to propose some remarks concerning this country. And because my English is not so good that the other participants, I will switch to Polish.
The basic thesis of my paper is as follows. The concept of transitional justice was not applied in Eastern Europe, in the whole of Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. In order to prepare for this presentation, I read works by Lavinia Stan, and we have a great pleasure of hosting her here. And on the basis of these publications, I could see a catalogue of means of transitional justice, transitive justice, that I could see applies in Eastern Europe. And in her book on Romania, she mentioned several means, and out of those, only 4 were introduced in Ukraine and 4 were not applied in Ukraine at all. The 4 applied there was rehabilitation of victims and payment of compensation, rebuke of the previous regime by new authorities, formulation of a new narrative about history in textbooks, and providing a public access to archives of secret services. The ones that were not applied so far were penal courts, truth commission, lustration, or property restitution. Of course, I could talk for a long time about causes of such a situation, but what is striking is that especially these means were not introduced, which are retributive in their nature. So like penal courts that are at least partially retributive, like lustration, or reports by the Truth Commission, the ones that were introduced. First of all, there is rehabilitation of victims that was introduced in 1991, so it is associated with perestroika, with the person of Gorbachev, and not with the new legal order in Ukraine. Whereas other means from the ones that were introduced, they were only introduced to a limited extent. The right to have access to archives to citizens, the former KGB archives, still belong to secret services of Ukraine, the follower of KGB, so formally there is access, but there are many blurred areas, lack of clarity, so practically it is very difficult to have the access to those archives. And it is also true about textbook narrative introduced by new authorities. For example, there was a notion of totalitarian state introduced in the textbooks, but there was no mention about guilt, responsibility. In a sense, the guilt is about those in power in the Soviet Union, so perhaps to one person or several people. There was no serious debate, no trace of any debate of responsibility in textbooks, of responsibility in Ukraine itself, responsibility for crimes that took place under the communist regime. Why did it happen? Generally speaking, we can say that there are two circumstances which did not actually facilitate the introduction of transitive justice. Firstly, it was a totally new state. That is why problems that seemed more important were focused on identity and statehood. On the other hand, Russia, the major heir of Russia, of the Soviet Union, did not make any decision about implementation of transitive justice, and it turns out that till today, introduction of transitive justice by other former republics proved successful only in the Baltic states. In Ukraine, it failed, I would say. And I would say that without a decision about introduction of these means in both countries, like both in Russia and in Ukraine, it is impossible for that to be successful in Ukraine. The first matter, namely the focus on creating statehood, state building, creating identity, this cause resulted, or such circumstances actually resulted in transferring blame on Russia and the Russians. The state of Ukraine was especially interested in providing narrative about its whole history, starting from the 9th century. It was not very much interested in coming to terms and analysis with the Soviet era. As a result, it is very difficult to have a public debate in Ukraine about perpetrators of crimes among Ukrainians themselves. Actually, there is no debate of that kind in Ukraine. So, another remark. In Ukraine and in neighboring countries, to a large extent, it pertains also to Poland. The very notion of transitive justice as an analytical notion, the field for research, was not very well grounded. They rather talk about a policy of memory, historical policy, and it is the perspective that they use to analyze current disputes about history. The most important thing in these disputes is international aspect, so Polish-Russian relations, Polish-Ukrainian relations, Ukrainian-Russian relations, whereas transitive justice perspective, and I believe the core of it is redressing individuals, especially victims, and building some foundations of the justice system anew. This perspective is not well grounded in Ukraine, and that is why it is actually absent from the scientific life of Ukraine. It is not analyzed, it is not the subject of comparative studies with other countries, and so on and so forth. During the last 25 years in Ukraine, after perestroika, there were two periods of more intense focus on the current history. The first period, early 1990s, when there was the dominant opinion that communism was the result of ideological misunderstanding, and communist crimes resulted from great persistence of those following ideology of communism. This approach, well, it was accompanied by the notion of totalitarianism, but this interpretation was not taking into account the notions of guilt or responsibility. So in the early 1990s, transitive justice was not introduced. Let me add that it did not exist back then as a ready-made concept. I mean, the transitive justice. Even in the countries that were in the forefront of this concept, like Latin America, it did not exist as a codified field of research. There were only some legal suggestions that may be implemented in a given country. The second period, when there was again more intense interest in the past of the Soviet times, was the term of office of President Yushchenko after the Orange Revolution. Yushchenko himself and his proponents decided that it would be like coming back to the path, to democracy, to the European Union, coming back on the road to these processes that was disrupted during President Kuchma, where there was a lot of authoritarian rule and oligarchic rule, and the concept of transitive justice formulated by then all over the world, reached Ukraine as a ready-made package of transitive justice, and Yushchenko, I believe, was aware that there is such a notion, that there is such a concept, and his first activities during his first 2 years as a president point to the fact that some means were to be implemented by him. And these were rather conciliatory measures, I would say, like a reconciliation between the Red Army and the Ukrainian insurgent army, the conflict of the 1940s. It would be good to organize the truth committee for that. So he realized that internal reconciliation was significant. He did not focus on retributive justice aspects. Unfortunately, it was not implemented because in Ukraine, there is a very strong division in terms of identity, and this identity division is so deep that we can mention that there are simply two national projects, mutually exclusive. And his proposals were not adopted, especially by representatives of the Ukrainian project based on post-Soviet memory. So he gradually decided to withdraw his proposals during his term of office, and he was going more towards retributive measures, which means that he went towards the policy of identity, which was to consolidate the Ukrainian nation to a large extent on the ethnical basis. The memory of anti-Soviet resistance in Western Ukraine, especially of 1940s, just after the Second World War, that pertained to repressions were addressed at the ethnic Ukrainians, led to the situation when the project was widely supported in Western Ukraine. And against the backdrop, we can place the Institute of National Remembrance, which was designed by Yushchenko and modeled after the Polish Institute. It was established by Prime Minister at the request of President. It was the initiative, quite small if you compare it with the Polish initiative, because only 105 full-time jobs were designed for the institute. There were no regional centers, and archives were not passed on to the institute because archives are still at the disposal of secret services of Ukraine, and they'll remain there at the moment. So the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, till the end of the term of office of Yushchenko, remained the institution that provided a certain PR advantage to the president's initiatives in terms of policy of memory. It was not a center of legislative activities. It did not animate any scientific initiatives in Ukraine. The president, following his policy, that was more leaning towards the policy of identity, was trying to involve the institute into his initiatives, and it was a matter of commemorating the Holodomor, which was the Great Famine. And as we know, there were two initiatives. There was the law that called the Holodomor, the Great Famine, called it a genocide against the Ukrainian nation. It was adopted in 2006, and there is a special punishment established for denying that there was any Holodomor as the genocide, and there was a judicial verdict by the end of his term of office when the court in Kiev gave a decision that it was a crime committed by authorities of the Soviet Union headed by Stalin, and the institute organized a great campaign of documentation of victims, commemoration in field, territorially, locally, at different administrative levels. It was a great campaign, but we may say that the institute played a minor role. It didn't have the sufficient staff. It was carried out by administrations of various layers of various localities under the guidance of the president and under pressure from the president, actually. Later on, during his presidency, going more towards West Ukrainian voters and their needs and more towards retributive means, because there were expectations like that in Western Ukraine, President became the patron of other commemorating projects, and the Institute of National Remembrance was also included in these projects. Like it was, for example, a memorial in Bykovnia near Kiev, where they commemorated the victims of the Great Terror of the 1930s, of the Babi Yar Memorial, commemorating the Babi Yar massacre of Jews after the German army entered Ukraine. And there was also a memorial called a prison in Łącka Street in Lviv. It is the memorial commemorating the victims repressed in Western Ukraine, but by all the three non-Ukrainian countries. So the Second Republic of Poland, the Soviet Union, the Third Reich, and the Soviet Union again. And here I must emphasize that this initiative of the memorial in Lviv was first a grassroots initiative connected with the Center of Research over Liberation Movements, headed by young historians in Western Ukraine. And I dare say that these young people have the superior goal of, or they want this symbolic space with many Soviet symbols to be replaced by nationalist symbols. So replacement of meanings from one extreme element of the extreme spectre of ideology, to the other extreme of the same spectrum. And Yushchenko believed it was legitimate in a way, because this grassroots initiative was supported by him, and he also involved the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance into the whole project. Here in Western Europe, we come across a very strong trend of presenting victims as heroes, talking about resistance against the Soviet Union, with avoiding, at the same time, avoiding difficult topics in the history of the Ukrainian insurgent army, like extermination and annihilation of Poles in Volyn and Galicia in 1943-44, or participation of members of this movement, of this army, and their participation in repressions against Jews. The last decision of courts during Yushchenko in policy of memory was giving the official status of hero to Stepan Bandera, which led to reaction of the European Parliament, because the European Parliament asked Ukraine to withdraw this decision, which happened after some time during the follower of Yushchenko, that is Yanukovych. So here we see that there are new authorities in Ukraine for the last 3 years, and we can say that it is not necessarily a change of mentality or a change of way of thinking about identity, and that identity should be uniform, homogeneous, that the state is meant to shape the identity. Perhaps it is about something else. There is a different approach to memory. Memory as a factor which is motivating politically. Yushchenko believed that political mobilization to introduce his projects is inspired by the memory, anti-Soviet memory, that it is this important factor. Now Yanukovych seems to believe that there is separation of memory from policy, so they allow that there is increasing role of certain post-Soviet stereotypes, and they do not actually pay too much attention to these topics. As for the very Institute of National Remembrance under Yanukovych, it was changed into the Center of Scientific Nature. There are other employees there, and now it is not involved in the current policies, in the policy making, but, for example, the head was Valery Soldatenko. He was nominated recently, and he's a communist, quite obviously. So it is not totally devoid of politics. So let me sum up by saying that, well, it seems that in Ukraine, we witness a situation when after 20-odd years, after the collapse of communism, the project of transitive justice is treated by the opposition as a form of coming to terms with authorities after 1991. They talk a lot about lustration against those who were corrupted, who cooperated with the Russian intelligence after 1991, that there should be lustration of those who were against the Orange Revolution of 2004, and so on and so forth. They do not talk too much about coming to terms with the Soviet past of the country. And the last conclusion on my part is that we face another threshold. Well, Ukraine is coming closer to the European Union. Now it has stopped quite recently, but they did not give up on the integration with the European Union. So I believe that if this process of approximation of Ukraine to the European Union, if it starts again, there will be a question in the European debate whether can we have a member of the European Union or associated member or full member? Can we have a member state or associated member state that did not undergo the Sovietization? Because there are monuments to Bandera, there are monuments to Lenin, and they simply remains even in the capital city, and was the creator of the totalitarian state. That's all from me. Thank you very much.